Welcome to Module 1. I'm very excited to be with you and to be sharing this information and process. Let's see, should I do a quick overview? Quick overview. All of these modules, as well as all of the education that I create and facilitate, all include several components. One of those is environmental education and integrating societal engagement with the environment and with each other. This is ecology at its base. Ecology is a set of systems that interact with one another. There's soil ecology, a forest ecology, global ecology, etc. Second thing we do is we self-reflect. So I often, definitely in each lesson or module, whatever it is that I'm producing, we'll have at least one question where we're thinking about information about ourselves. So how we grow personally, how we interact with the world, how we interact with the environment, how we interact with ourselves or each other. And then another thing that we do is I often do self-reflecting questions about the information that I'm giving. I won't do those for all of these modules, but it is a staple of most of the education that I do. So I won't do it as much in these because we have a short amount of time, and so I may throw some in there. There is one in this first module, a consideration, but it won't necessarily be in each one. And what else? I try to bring some joy and optimism to it. You know, I think one of the mainstays of social change is that when we engage our cognitive mind and our solution-oriented thinking, and we look, along with that, we're looking at data because we can't strategize without good information, things become more relieving. And stress is often caused by a lack of understanding and ignorance, just fears that don't have any base or we're not taking the time to slow down and plan about them, understand them and plan within their context and for our future. So that is a mainstay of all of the education, the foundation of what I'm doing. We're engaging our minds and our hearts and information and each other in order to come to a place of empowerment and action and planning and connection. So all of those things. That's a brief introduction. Okay, this first module is first we will touch on how the first cell was created. So the cell is the smallest unit of life as science has defined it. And I'm going to describe first how that cell came to be. Then I will touch very briefly in this module on how everything else has evolved from that point on. All of the modules in sequence lead us towards more complexity and highlight diversity as a mainstay of a healthy environment. So, jumping right in. A long time ago. So, 4.5 billion years ago, the Earth was created. And at that time, it was a big ball of steaming lava. And that eventually turned, so magma just, the whole thing was just a burning ball. And that eventually started cooling, and thunderstorms and all of that things, and water precipitated. And when that water precipitated, it rained and fell onto the Earth and cooled the magma, which became rock. That's magma is the precursor to rock, and filled with water. And that now, that big worldwide ocean, we call primordial soup. And that's because nothing in it had actually come together. Heat and magma, it just restarts everything to a base, to its basic components. So what was floating around were just these pieces of atoms coming into molecules and eventually becoming more complex. So at a certain point, a molecule was formed called a phospholipid. And a phospholipid has a phosphorus head and then two lipid tails. And they stuck together. They were attracted to each other side by side into a layer in a shell shape. So they enclosed a space within with fluid inside. And it was actually 2 layers. So the phosphorus head and the lipids, and then the another layer of the lipids with another whole shell layer within that. So we call it a phospholipid bilayer because it's actually fluid. Those 2 membranes can kind of move around each other on, if that was all that was there. But that was the first thing that formed. And another molecule that formed very early on was called a nucleic acid. And that is actually the precursor to RNA and DNA. So viruses mostly are RNA, although there's a lot of viruses that are composed of DNA. And then the DNA in all of our cells, both of those are nucleic acids. So there was a nucleic acid in the environment. Well, it found its way through this very permeable fluid shell and found safety there, and was able to use the safe environment from all the other reactions that were going on in the primordial soup to replicate itself, to use its mechanisms and create more of itself. And then it burst out of the cell. And that's what a virus does today. And it did that over and over. Well, in the meantime, there were other components, other little molecules, other cell-like structures that were forming, and even some cells eventually that formed, that integrated into this membrane, into some of these membranes. So in this first cell, there were some other things that were working its way in there, and they eventually there was a symbiosis. So the components that were in there also found safety and were able to help give different functions to the shell. And eventually it started resisting this virus cell, this nucleic acid that was coming in and using it and then leaving, by actually incorporating a part of it or a copy of it into its own cell, into its own shell. And it used that in order to create a resistance to the one that was coming in and leaving, using it and leaving. And the one that it incorporated it became the DNA, or most likely the DNA, but the nucleic acid of that cell. And that is how the first cell formed. So it was actually taking in these different components from the environment, integrating them with a mutualistic function, and then eventually resisting a previous component. And it was through this resistance that it became a cell. Fascinating enough, that's how a lot of evolution occurs, is by challenge. So I'm going to get a little bit more into that in a moment. I'm going to ask you a first question for you to consider. And what I encourage for all of these questions is that you take this time to really consider. So, if it's information about environmental data or concepts, it's going to help for you to reach and see what you can come up with and what maybe you've heard or you intuit in order to better integrate the information when you do get it. And if it's self-reflection, take the time, because this is a time for growth. It's a time for being able to self-reflect. If you recognize a pattern in yourself, maybe you didn't before, then you have power to change it if you don't like it, or strengthen it if you do. So the first question is, in relation to this, what challenges have you experienced in your life that have grown you, that have allowed you to be a higher form of who you are, that you've integrated this challenge and you've conferred some kind of strength from it? So consider that. Write it down. If you're driving, just really think about it and have it in your mind. And please have it very strongly in there, in your heart, in your mind, on paper, before you come back, because that is how this works the best. So I'll see you in a second. So, continuing. Viruses have continued to remain a component that drives evolution. So even after this first cell was created, literally by fighting off a virus, there have throughout time, our bodies are constantly fighting off viruses. And viruses inundations can cause mutations. And those mutations, most of them are, not very impactful. And some of them, every once in a while, we get a mutation that drives evolution forward in a very strong way. And part of that is that, there are viruses in the environment. And so what we are able to tolerate in the environment, any biological species, what we're able to tolerate, we then survive. And then it's our capacity to survive that allows us to move forward and continue having babies and sharing that genetic information with our offspring. And there's other factors as well that we'll get more into, especially in the next module, in terms of the niches that life finds. Okay, I have an earth science question for you. Why is it important that we don't use herbicides and we don't use pesticides? And why is it perhaps even ironic when we use them? That's a little bit of a hint, but think about it. Think about any and all answers that you can possibly come up with, because this is how you learn the best. Stretching your mind and then allowing that information to integrate. Use your intuition. Guess a little bit if you don't have any information. Think about what you've heard and have something structured in your mind before you come back. Okay, I will get into one of the reasons specifically. And one of the things that is most foundational to a healthy environment is biodiversity. So that is on all levels. That is in the soil. When we have a very diverse population of microbes and insects and all of the components of life, then we also have very healthy plant systems. We have the capacity to have very healthy animal systems. And it's the diversity that allows strength to prevail in an environment. And here's one example. If you have, say, a crop of one type of plant and a bug comes that can eat that one plant, then that entire crop is gone and there's no more plants on that piece of land. And if there's many, many different types of plants and that bug can eat one, maybe two plants, but that bug can eat only a certain amount of plants, which is like most creatures, we can't all eat everything. Then there is resistance to something that is degrading the environment. So that is one example of how diversity is so pinnacle to health on our earth. When we use these components, these chemicals, the chemicals attack a certain metabolic process. So we're going to talk more about a very specific metabolic process with methane in the next module. But if something converts, how our bodies use food to convert it to fat or energy, etc., or create protein with the amino acids. So it's a pathway. And what these insecticides and pesticides and these herbicides do is it attacks a certain component in a plant or in an animal, an insect, that creates a certain function for that life form, and it interrupts it. And what happens is that it doesn't, because of how evolution occurs, it doesn't just it's not isolated. Those pathways are not isolated to just one species. So if the way that our bodies convert food into energy is going to be different on some level to another species, but we're going to share some things in common. And that's how evolution occurs, is there's these small changes over time. So there actually tends to be a lot in common between species. And so what this does is it not only attacks maybe some other plants or maybe some other insects that we're not even targeting, but it also affects the diversity of microbes in the soil. And as we will learn more and more over the next modules, is that soil diversity is at the basis of health for all of the environment. So soil health is one of the most important things that we can focus on in order to have a healthy, sustainable, resilient future. So that is one reason, and it affects the diversity specifically. So to summarize the irony I mentioned at the beginning in this question, when we apply pesticides and herbicides, it decreases the microbial diversity in the soil. But with microbial diversity, we see less and less pests and less weeds. So as a soil becomes more mature and has a greater diversity of microbiology, we don't see the pests that we use pesticides for, and we likewise don't see the weeds that we use herbicides for. So it actually works against that intention, hence the irony. In conclusion, this module for one is a little smaller. This one is, I'm just giving away so that you have a little taste of what's going on in this series. And it's the very simple structure that we dive more deeply into through the modules. We got the basic cell formation all the way to a bit about how evolution occurs, how diversity has evolved, and how important diversity is. So we're going to get far more into each of those topics with the next details in the modules that we'll cover soon. So the next module is on the 3 domains of life. All life falls into 3 domains specifically, and that's based on cell structure. And then and we're going to look at it through the lens of the methane molecule and the interaction of those cells with it. And then we're going to move on to fungus and then go bigger from there. So thanks for joining. I look forward to seeing you in the next module. Bye.